apply for a controlled activity consent. Heterogeneity, well, we'll hear more about the people who know about this stuff, but that was important for the council to realise that one person's mitigation options aren't the same as another person's, even if they're right next door. Cost and practicality. So just passing on to you, Sandra, we'll hear a little bit more.
Okay. Shall I swap you with?
And now we're going to do an interpretive dance. I'll stand here and be a newsreader.
Right. So in terms of rules that the council put in place, each farmer gets a nitrogen allocation, which was initially based on the benchmarking. That's what Justine mentioned, the 2000 to 2005 best year for each farm. The individual farm nitrogen limit is confirmed through the resource consent system, and farmers maintain a nutrient plan using overseer, which has already been spoken about. And of course, the council audits the inputs in the nitrogen plan or nutrient management plan. How trading occurs. Farmers are likely to trade to make changes in land use, perhaps sheep and beef to forestry, to intensify, to de-intensify. Trading requires each of the parties to hold a resource consent. It was something that Hugh talked about earlier, I think, was whether all the landowners in the area have a resource consent, and in the Lake Taupo catchment, small landholders, lifestyle blocks aren't part of that system. So each landholder wanting to trade has to have that resource consent. They reach agreement, the two parties or the however many parties wanting to trade, and council staff confirm the changed limits through the resource consent system, and at that stage trade can occur. So who is trading? The trust obviously is a big buyer in the catchment. Also in the catchment, a dairy farmer has been very active in buying. There's been recent reports of trading through a broker, or one recent report anyway, which suggests that farmers are perhaps becoming more comfortable with the idea of trading. In terms of progress, the trust is 2/3 on its way to achieving its target to remove nitrogen through the system, but an impediment to this is perhaps that while the trust has $81.5 million in funding, it's fed out over a number of years, and so they're confined to doing deals that reflect that, which isn't always easy. And about 70% of the resource consents are in place. Incentives and disincentives for trading. So incentives for trade exist around the ability of farmers to reduce N at a lesser cost than the value of N in the market. Perhaps the problem is that it may be difficult to establish the price of N in the market, given that most trades so far have been privately done, although quite possibly within the community, those wanting to trade are aware of the price. The carbon market has also provided incentives to sell nitrogen allowances and change land use, which is interesting because it just shows the effect of external things. The trading system doesn't happen in isolation. Disincentives to trading, and that's something has been talked about earlier today, is transaction costs. Yes, the resource consent system can be expensive and is perhaps an impediment to small trades or leasing. The overseer model. Overseer is essential to the cap and trade system in Taupo, but it wasn't developed as a tool for regulation. Inputs into the model, some go in by default, such as rainfall data, soil types, pasture type. Manual inputs include stocking rates, supplementary feed, stock management practices. For farmers, using overseer has been a big change, and some are using it directly, but I understand that most farmers work with it through consultants. It was mentioned earlier, I can't remember who it was, perhaps Justine actually. For the council, this was also a big change, using Overseer as a tool for monitoring and compliance, but the system relies on people within the council having to develop a much greater understanding about farming and farming practices in order to make it work. Something else in relation to Overseer, there are versions of it. Hugh mentioned that earlier. The Taupo scheme currently relies on version 5.4.33 of Overseer, and it continues to be updated. Version 5.4.9 is about to be released. What that will mean for us is that individual farms will have to be calibrated into the new version before the older version disappears. But for our purposes, there's likely to be little difference between those versions. Back to the dance.
Cool. I guess the caveat on that is for the moment. So really interested in where Motu's got to for resetting annually and saying this is the version we're using. I suspect there might be some practical implications of that for farmers, and especially as to what date you choose. So Mike, it'd be lovely to hear more from you about that. And in fact, the version that the council's used to benchmark or to assess where people's starting allocation is at, that's about to disappear forever. So the council has been holding that version in use. It's not the most current one, but that's about to just go. So there's definitely issues about versions, and for anyone that's not an RMA expert, we'll chat afterwards about why it's so important, and especially when you set in a rule an external document like that changes. So just to touch on what changed, we'll hear about from the farming perspective shortly, but I just really wanted to emphasise for any council people here, it's a radical change. Simply setting a assimilative capacity, setting a limit in a receiving water body is a big change. And focusing all your policies and rules and methods on that, that's a big change, let alone the introduction of market mechanism. So that's what I mean by the underpinning principles were different, and I guess the way around that is to make sure at a council level everybody that's new and comes in on this understands why. Because if you don't understand why, you can make tiny little incremental changes as you implement that make a big change overall. And I think that's really critical for councils to get their head around. Just finally here on some lessons, the question about allocation always comes up. And I guess the point here is that there's some things that economists, and I agree it's really important to get them in at the ground floor, can advise us on, but they can't advise us on income distribution or equity questions. So don't totu in the market if that's what you're worried about, really. If you're worried about fairness and people's incomes, then address that through other means. So this idea about unknowns, about how things will work, I think councils getting their head around having to learn new skills, new processes is really essential, and going to the people who are the best sources. This is in the desktop exercise. That thing about pragmatic versus being precise and complex, we've had a lovely little illustration this morning about that. Just to remind you, we did go through that about this idea of, we didn't call it vintages. In essence, we said it's a lake, it'll all turn up eventually. Let's not worry about the complexity at the moment. We excluded lifestyle blocks, as Sandra mentioned. In hindsight, perhaps we could have included them. Again, it was a bit of an unknown. We made a judgment call. Oh, they won't, the transaction costs will be too high, but actually we really didn't know that. So again, that's up for debate in the future. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
We'll come back